This is Project 4L60E, Part 2, Lesson 7. Welcome back. In the last lesson, we assembled the reverse input drum and the body section of the front pump. In this lesson, we'll work on the cover section, assemble the entire pump, test fit it to the input drums, and finally install these assemblies into the case. In addition to the tools used in previous lessons, you will need needle-nosed and inside snap ring pliers with small tips, a half-round file, and an inch-pounds torque wrench. We finished the body half of the pump, so set it aside. Get the cover half. Like the other half of the pump, the cover has to be disassembled, cleaned, check for damage, and reassembled. There are 5 assemblies to remove: pump screen filter, pressure relief ball and spring, converter clutch valve, pressure regulator, and filter seal. Begin by removing the pump filter screen here. Use needle nose pliers to twist and pull it out. Set it aside. There is a pressure relief assembly in this area retained by this pin. Make sure you are wearing safety glasses and turn the pump like so. Use pliers to compress the spring while you push the pin out with a mechanic's pick. As the pin is pushed out, the pick will retain the spring. Set the pin aside. Hold your thumb or a shop towel over the hole and pull the pick out. Turn it over. The spring and ball will come out. Set them aside. We need to remove the converter clutch valve and springs located here. Remove this inside snap ring. Remove this part. It's called the valve stop. Remove the valve. Tilt the cover and the springs will fall out. Look carefully and confirm that you have both inner and outer springs. Set these pieces aside. The pressure regulator assembly comes out next. It consists of the regulator valve, springs, booster sleeve and valve, and a snap ring. Remove this inside snap ring. The booster sleeve should come out from spring pressure. Pull it out and notice the spool valve inside. Set them down. Tilt the cover. The inner and outer springs will fall out. Set them in order with the sleeve. Shake the cover. The pressure regulator valve should fall out. Set it with the springs. If the valve sticks in its bore, use the mechanic pick to push it out from here. Finally, we need to remove this metal clad filter seal with a screwdriver and hammer. Let's move to another work area to avoid disturbing the parts on this bench. Like the front seal, we need to collapse the metal clad to get it out. Begin by using a small screwdriver like so. Then use a larger one. Pry it out. Clean the cover in mental spirits and return to the other bench. The bare cover has been cleaned and allowed to dry. At this point, carefully clean all of the small parts we removed from it and allow them to dry. Inspect this area for wear. Like the other part of the pump, it should be smooth with no gouging or grooves which you can catch with a fingernail. This cover is fine. Check the condition of the stator support splines. They should look like these. It's not uncommon to find them worn to the point they're about to strip out. Turn the cover over. Check the journals which support the reverse input clutch bushings. There should be no steps or grooving from wear. These are nice and straight. Make sure the sealing rings turn freely. The last areas to inspect are the bushings for the input shaft and the bore for the sealing rings. Here, and here, and in here. Go to where you set the input drum and check them for wear. First, check the bore where the sealing rings on the input shaft ride. It should be smooth with no grooves from wear. Place it on the shaft. Lift the cover up about 1/16 of an inch and rock the cover side to side. There should be only a slightly detectable side play of a few thousandths. If play is excessive, replace both bushings. Note the installed depth from the end of the shaft. Drive them out with a screwdriver and install the new ones from the kit. This bushing requires an extra installation step. First of all, notice that it is installed flush with the bearing surface. Then look closely at the chamfer here, which helps to prevent cutting the sealing rings on the input shaft when installing the pump. If you need to replace this bushing, note that the new bushing does not have much of a taper. It's almost square and could damage the sealing rings. I always use a rounded file to make a more generous taper. Let me show you. Collapse and drive the old bushing out. Drive the new one in. Make sure it is flush or slightly below the bearing surface. Use a file and make a chamfer like so. Thoroughly clean the cover again to remove filings and blow it dry. Now test fit it on the input shaft. Watch closely to make sure the bushing guides the seals in without any damage. Slide the cover completely down and onto the bearing. If it fits too tightly on the journal, tap it with a wood block and hammer to knock down high spots on the bushing. Let's finish the pump assembly. This is the filter neck seal. We'll drive it in with the socket later in Lesson 8 after the pump is installed and well supported. Place some fluid on the pressure regulator valve. Install it in its bore. Turn the cover sideways, and it should fall in. The end of the valve should rest here. Place the two springs in. The booster sleeve and valve would go in next. However, I recommend that you always replace both with a new assembly. Almost every valve and sleeve I check are badly worn and can cause problems such as a burned band and 3/4 clutch failure. You must identify which of two styles of valve and sleeve assemblies your model has by measuring the sleeve length. The early style has a sleeve 1 inch and 907 thousandths of an inch long, and the late type has a sleeve 1 inch and 810 thousandths of an inch long. Not only are they not interchangeable, but you also cannot always determine which one you need by year of production. You must measure your old one. Ours is an early 1 inch 907 thousandths type. Get the new assembly. Pull the spool valve out and put some transgel or small amount of grease on the short end. Push the valve back in. This will keep the valve inside the sleeve as we install it into the cover. Put fluid on it. Start it in its bore. Make sure you wear glasses and install the snap ring. Look closely to see that the ring is fully in its groove. Install the inner and outer converter clutch valve springs. Put fluid on the valve. Install it with the smaller diameter end in first. Use a small screwdriver to make sure the valve can stroke completely in its bore freely. If the fit is a little tight, tap it gently with a screwdriver and hammer. This helps to knock down any small burrs or scratches in the bore. Put the valve stop in. Replace the snap ring. Push in on the valve through the hole in the valve stop. It will stroke about 1/2 inch. Install the pressure relief ball and spring next. Look down into this bore and make sure the seat for the ball is free of debris. Put the ball in. Place the spring in. Start the pin in its bore. Put safety glasses on and compress the spring with a 1/4 inch socket. Push the pin halfway in. Use a screwdriver to push down on the spring and finish installing the pin. Push it completely into its recess. The last component to install into the cover is the screen filter, which goes here. Get the screen filter sub-kit and the miscellaneous kit. Get the pump screen filter. Get the O-ring for this groove. There are 3 black O-rings in this assortment, larger than any of the others. Get one of them. Place it in the groove and add some fluid to it. And the bore in the pump. Push it in. It should fit tight for a good seal. Get the pump body we set aside earlier. To join the halves together, first make sure both mating surfaces are clean. Then locate these square areas and rotate 1/2 to index them together. Place the cover over the body. Start the 5 bolts. Before tightening the bolts, use an alignment tool like this. This band is a unique tool to place around the pump and then tighten to perfectly align the 2 halves. If you don't have access to this tool, let me show you a substitute. Get a white bucket like this one. Its diameter is close to that of the pump. Cut the top portion off. Cut a 1-inch strip from it. We'll make a clamp from this. Bend it like this to make a tab. Mark where the other tab should be. Bend it like the other one. Drill a hole and add washers, bolt, and nut, and you have an alignment band. Place the tool around the pump and tighten. The bucket I made this tool from had a slight taper, so I placed the narrow edge just over the parting line. Notice how the cover can rotate but not move side to side because of the tight fit of the tool. Look down into the pump to case bowl holes and make sure they're aligned together. Tighten the bolts finger tight. Use an inch-pounds torque wrench and tighten to 220 inch-pounds. Place the pump onto the torque converter far enough to engage the rotor lugs and make sure it turns freely. Take it back to the bench. Set the pump down with the filter inlet facing you at the 6 o'clock position. Install the seal retainer by pressing it on with this tab at the 5 o'clock position. Turn the pump over. Place a small amount of trans gel or grease on the 2 tabs of this thrust washer and install it. The tabs go in the holes. We need to test fit the input shaft and reverse input drum sealing rings and decide whether or not to replace them. Because replacement of these rings requires special installation tools like these, and because I rarely see them damaged, I recommend that you reuse the existing ones if possible. As odd as this sounds, it's actually a practical approach. Here's why. If the bore in the pump where these rings seal is smooth with no damage, and the ring lands surrounding the seals show no evidence of metal-to-metal contact with the ring bore in the pump, then these seals are okay. I recommend not removing them. The seal is a very spongy, resilient nylon material which is always in a state of compression when installed. In other words, it's always trying to expand and seal, even after years of heat cycles. If you don't have access to these tools, let me show you how to proceed, and then I'll demonstrate actual replacement procedure with the tools. Pinch the ring until you can get a mechanic's pick behind it. Push the tapered part of the pick down to barely stretch the ring just slightly. Stretch all 4 the same way. Mold each one with your fingers to smooth out the bump. Carefully center the rings. Install the pump on the shaft. Keep it straight and push down until it bottoms on the thrust bearing. You'll feel the interference fit and drag of the rings. It should turn effortlessly. Lift the pump off and check to make sure the rings were not cut. These look fine. The approach is the same with the two reverse input drum rings. If you find no gouging or harsh wear on these journals, then these seals are okay too. Expand them slightly with the pick. And test fit the drum. Notice how the drum will not come free by lifting it up easy. The seals fit very tight when they get to the slightly smaller diameter of the bushings. You have to pull it up sharply. Now let's replace the seals. Begin by cutting the seals off with a utility knife or razor blade. But before I destroy them, let me use this ring sizing tool and test the old ring fit. This bore is the same diameter as the one in the pump. It has a taper on this end to help guide it over the new rings as you push down and compress them to their final size. As you can see, it takes considerable force to push it over the rings. The old rings have a tight fit and would seal like new ones. Now I'll demonstrate how new rings are installed. Cut the old seals off like this. Get the sealing ring kit. This tool installs the seals onto the input shaft. Force the 4 seals over the tapered section and down the tube. Place it over the shaft and push one off into the first groove. Do this with all 4. Compress them with your fingers. Then use the sizing tool. Pull it off. Test fit the pump. Cut the reverse input sealing rings off. Place the new ones on the tapered installation tool. Push them off into the grooves. Compress them as much as possible with your fingers. Use the sizing tool. Test fit the drum. Install the reverse input drum onto the input housing. These splines must engage the 4 friction plates in the drum. Rotate the drum back and forth to engage the clutches. All 4 are engaged when the drum bottoms out onto the thrust bearing. Install the pump onto the drums. Leave them together as an assembly for about 15 minutes, compressing the sealing rings. Set them aside and bring the transmission back to the bench. Let's finish this lesson by finally installing the pump and drums into the case. As you can see, I've repositioned the transmission onto the bench as we left it in lesson 4. Get the Ford assembly. Get the new band. Get the 7 pump to case bolts and the band anchor. Set the pump aside. The splines of the 3/4 frictions have to go over the splines of the input ring gear. The notches in the reverse input drum index with the tabs on the drive shell. If you'll recall, here are the splines of the input ring gear. Here are the tabs on the drive shell. Place the drums into the transmission. Rotate the shaft back and forth, slightly lifting as you turn. The drums will drop down as the clutches align with the splines. Continue until it will not drop any further. When completely installed, the reverse input drum will be below the case here. Apply some fluid to the band. Place it in around the drum. Place the band anchor into its bore. Make sure the tip engages the hole in the band. Get the pump to case O-ring and gasket. Place the gasket in. Place the pump to case O-ring on the pump. Make sure the thrust washer is still in place here. Align the pump with the case. The filter inlet hole should be at the 6 o'clock position with the pan rail. Install it part way. Use the pick and replace the O-rings on the pump bolts. Place a drop of fluid on the O-ring and threads of each one. Install 2 bolts and align the holes. Install all 7 finger tight. Use a 13mm socket to tighten the bolts a half a turn a time in a cross pattern. When all are snug, test to make sure there is some in play. After setting the case on its side, use a torque wrench and tighten bolts to 220 inch-pounds. Transmission end play should be between 15 and 35 thousandths. It can be measured using feeler gauges and locking pliers. Push the shaft in. Double up a section of shop tower and put it over the input shaft to protect it from damage. Lightly clamp the pliers onto the shaft against the stator support. Pull the shaft out and measure the gap. I get 29 thousandths in play, which is fine. Finally, get the O-ring for the input shaft and install it in its groove. This completes Lesson 7. In Lesson 8, we'll move on to the valve body area.